I want to talk to you today about how I am completely changing the way I am gardening in 2023. I want to share with you the changes I'm making and the why behind them, because the why is really important. So there are two big whys for this, two reasons why I'm reevaluating everything I have done in the garden over the past 2 years since we built our large garden that we call the farm. I made another version of this video yesterday, but I was so sick. I had thrown up. I was having severe stomach cramps. I was just a mess. And I still plowed through, made the video, and then I rewatched it and I'm like, no, we cannot do that. But that's a really good example of why I am reevaluating how I garden. So I have a couple of things. One is called diverticulitis, which is why I was sick yesterday and why I am sick very often throughout the month. It is your intestines, your colon can get inflamed. These little pockets called diverticuli, I believe they're called, get inflamed. And it's often based on what you've eaten or stress levels. And although that's not proven, but I can promise you that it is part of it, often instigated for me, by nightshades. Some people have trouble with nuts and seeds. For me, I have found that nightshades and sugar seem to be the biggest causes of my flare-ups. So I have a flare-up right now. The other thing that I have is something called interstitial cystitis, and that is, it sort of mimics a bladder infection, but there's no actual infection, but you get all the pain, like incredible pain, to the point where you think you have a kidney infection. I have gone to the ER multiple times thinking that something was wrong with my kidneys. They find no infection, no white blood cells in the urine, and it took me decades to get a diagnosis. Now we know interstitial cystitis is a thing. It's a chronic bladder inflammation, I guess you might say. And again, very much based on diet and stress, like your emotional health. And so I personally think that both of these things are linked to the fact that I have candida, systemic candida, a yeast overgrowth, all my body very unbalanced. And this comes from years and years of having chronic sinus and ear infections, taking antibiotics for those, and kind of destroying my gut in the process. Now, one of the things that I discovered along the way, and it took me a while to really get to this, is that dairy is the main cause of the inflammation for my ears, for my sinuses, and for my lungs. Cutting out dairy has been life-changing. I can have a cat. I was allergic to cats. I can actually be around a cat. I still deal with one severe allergen, which is dust mites, and we have rugs in our house, so that's something that we have to deal with. But other than that, eliminating dairy, and this includes raw dairy, has completely transformed my body. And not having the sinus infections and the ear infections means that I'm not taking antibiotics. Now, even if I was getting them, I know now how to heal those more naturally. But, growing up and in my early 20s, just completely debilitating sinus infections. So I would say about 4 times a year, I would take antibiotics to heal a severe sinus infection. So anyway, I have systemic candida. I had my first yeast infection when I think I was 8 years old. And so it's just been this long discovery process. Fast forward to peri-menopause. So I have been in peri-menopause easily for about 4 years, I would say. I'm 48. And my hormones are wreaking a lot of havoc on my body. I'm experiencing migraines. I'm exhausted. My joints hurt when I sit down for even an hour. It's hard to get back up. So I am experiencing a lot of weight gain, mood swings, anxiety, out of control anxiety. So clearly there is an imbalance in my body. When I ovulate, from the time I ovulate till I bleed, I experience these flare-ups of diverticulitis, I experience the migraines, I experience the weight gain, I experience the moodiness, the low energy. And so I have about 2 weeks where things just are not good. They're not okay. So I've got the health stuff, but the other thing, my other why for why I'm changing the way I'm gardening, and it ties into this, but it's also something that I think I'm probably not the only one who's experiencing, is I've sort of gone from an intuitive form of gardening, just like I like to intuitively eat, intuitively cook, an intuitive gardening that I feel like I've done my whole life, into a gardener who is strongly influenced because the homesteading world, the gardening world just took off over the last few years. And so there's YouTube videos, there's blogs, there's Instagram accounts. Like, for me, I just started following everybody and watching these videos, and someone would say, oh, buy these tomatoes, I'd buy those seeds, buy these, oh, I got these seeds, buy these seeds. And I just kind of went a little bit overboard. I was logging so much time watching videos, reading blogs, looking at Instagram accounts, rather than gardening. I was changing the way I was planting because somebody would say, you need to have this amount of squash in storage to get you through the winter. My family doesn't eat squash. I'm the only person that eats squash. So I'm growing all these squash, but nobody's eating these squash. So then I have a freezer full of squash that nobody's eating, that I've had for a year. And it's just like my freezer is filled with corn, but we don't really eat corn. I was trying to grow corn just to grow corn because everybody's growing corn, but we don't really need to take up that space growing corn because we have a local farmer who grows corn that we can get what we need very inexpensively, locally, and I'm not taking up precious garden space because I just don't have a ton of space. I was using 3 rows of my garden to grow tomatoes, and nightshades are one of the biggest causes of inflammation in my body. So why am I doing this? Now, fermented stuff is way better for me. Fermented salsa, fermented hot sauce, fermented pretty much anything really works better in my body. But I was growing 3 rows of tomatoes, and tomatoes were taking over our house, and it just doesn't make sense for me and my family. So I was making all these choices based on influencers in the homesteading world, in the gardening world, and I'm just trying to pull back. And for me to do that, I kind of have to erase everything. I had to leave all the groups I was in. I had to stop looking at Instagram, stop following people, stop reading stuff. And it's not that I don't enjoy them. I do, and I have learned so much. But for me to hear myself, to hear my own inner voice, to realize what my family's needs are, how I can use this one precious space for gardening that I have the most efficiently, I have to quiet all those voices. Okay, the scarf's coming off. I'm getting a little hot. I'm getting all worked up. Okay, so what does this look like? So one of the first changes that I have made since this hormonal inflection and the diverticulitis has just kind of gone crazy is somewhere I had heard Tim Ferriss suggest for women to start their day eating 30 grams of protein, and this will help with hormone balances and weight gain. And 30 grams of protein is actually hard to get. Like, an egg only has 6 grams of protein. So you do need to have a meat source to make this easier to do. So I've been doing grass-fed ground meat with an egg or 2. I can do an omelet, and then I need to put some meat into that or have some meat on the side. So it's taken me a while. 1 can of tuna is pretty much, if I don't have anything else, I'll do a can of tuna. But it has significantly changed things for me. I was doing it without fail the month of January. My energy was up. I was feeling better. Even though we were kind of dealing with some sicknesses, I was still feeling so much better. My sugar cravings were down. My energy was up. It was amazing. And on the days that I do not do the 30 grams of protein, my body is out of whack. Everything changes, and starts to, like, I can feel it start to kind of break down. So Dave and I have switched to a very high protein diet, and we are going to take that probably even further. And one of the things that I'm looking at is my freezer space. So we just had a whole market pig from our local free range grass-fed farm, and it takes up a whole freezer. Now for me to have a freezer full of that protein, which makes my body thrive, versus a freezer full of, you know, broccoli and tomatoes and whatever else, it just doesn't, you know, squash that we're not using, it just doesn't make sense. So I do have the 2 freezers downstairs, and I still want one freezer to be primarily fruits and veggies, but I need to really take a look at what it is that we need, what it is that we as a family need. Green beans, peas, zucchini, cucumbers, potatoes, carrots, and then I am going to grow tomatoes, but I'm going to do only 1 row. So I'm gonna have so much more space in my garden this year. I wanna grow a ton of lettuce. Lettuce is one of those foods that just feels so good in my body. Zucchini, summer squash feels so good in my body. Peas, green beans feel so good in my body. The kids love cucumbers. Everybody eats potatoes, but we don't eat but everybody doesn't eat winter squash. So it's those kinds of changes that I'm making. While I know winter squash is a high caloric, really good homesteading food to have, if it's not something we eat, it just doesn't make sense that I'm spending all this space in my garden growing it and creating a really crazy amount of squash bugs that are then coming in and eating everything. Melon plants, cucumber plants, they're pretty much taking over everything. So I really need to dial that back, and I might even do a year of no squash just to see if I can get the squash bugs more under control this year. I know that they'll come to my zucchini and my summer squash, but I am going to try my best to deal with them as they come. So this is all about like health, energy, using my resources that I have, and knowing that I have a local farmers market. So if there's anything that we feel that we don't have, or one of the family members says, oh, I really wish we had some of this, we can go to the farmers market. Like this year I'm thinking I'm probably not gonna grow fava beans, even though I loved it. I loved growing fava beans and I love them so much. They took up a whole lot of space for a very long time, and I probably could get the equivalent fava beans at my farmer's market. So it's little things like that. If I find that growing zucchini and summer squash is just generating so many squash bugs, I'm just gonna stop this year and I'm going to go to the farmer's market and I'm gonna source my foods, my summer squash and my zucchini from the farmer's markets instead. That way I can give my garden a break from being devastated by the squash bugs. So I'm just making little decisions like that. I'm going to grow a lot of green beans because we love eating them out of the freezer and fresh. I'm going to keep growing carrots and onions and garlic, things that make our bodies feel really good and that we enjoy eating. I'm going to grow a lot of potatoes. So those rows where there would have been tomatoes are going to be potatoes. And that, as far as like a really nutrient dense food, I would rather have a potato over a tomato any day. I can make a pot of mashed potatoes to feed my family, but a pot of sauce, most of my kids don't want to eat tomatoes anyway, and my body is just being very clear that it is not a food that's working for it right now. And maybe eventually it will be once I do a little bit more healing. But right now, with perimenopause flaring up everything that it could possibly flare up, I just have to dial back on some of those things. So that is why I am changing the way I garden in 2023. I'm gonna sit down and make a list of what would make sense to use the farmers markets for, what would make sense to use my precious garden space for, and then just look at what is already coming up and what is already available. Like we've planted strawberries and asparagus. Sage is all over the garden, and sage is so good for me, for you, for us. There's chives coming up. I always have green onions, spring onions that are just constantly being grown from seeds dropping or me overwintering them. We'll start the season early with cabbages and potatoes and maybe some carrots, root vegetables. Once I get those lists made up, I can really see what makes sense for me to grow. And all the noise, everybody else's noise, I'm just gonna tuck it away. It doesn't mean that I don't value these voices, because I value them so much and I am so grateful for them. But this year, I need to hear me. So as I share my gardening journey this year, it will be very much focused on my health and the joy, just the joy of being in the garden. And if that means no squash in my garden so that I can have a year without squash bugs, I'm gonna go for it. I'm gonna do that. And I'm just gonna take that year off and let everything kind of lay low. It's healing for the garden as well. You know, if I have all these plants that are being devastated by squash bugs, it feels like the equivalent of my body, like being devastated by the bad bacteria. And we don't need that, right? So if we need to eliminate something for health and healing, I feel like the same is true for my garden. The final thing I'm doing is I'm not buying any new seeds. I'm using what I have, because one of the things that I noticed I started to do, based a lot on like the influencers out there, is I was buying so many seeds, and people were talking about scarcity of seeds. You might not be able to get seeds. So I was kind of hoarding seeds. And I don't want to live like that. I don't want to be like that. I want to use what I have. Sustainability practices are all about using what we have rather than constantly grabbing more and more and more. I don't want to be that kind of hoarder. I definitely want to be prepared. I want to know that I have food security, and I do. And I have plenty of seeds. So I will not be buying new seeds this year. I am going to go through and use what I have. And that's pretty exciting to me, because then I know like whatever I have is what I can grow. I have all these choices that instead of going out and obsessing over all these new varieties that I could have, or buying more tomato varieties when I have more tomato seeds than we could probably ever use, I'm going to plant what we have. I hope this was helpful. If you're new here, I'm so happy to know you. I'm Hannah. This is Sweet Fern Homestead, where we talk about sacred home, sacred rhythm, and sacred roots. If you enjoyed this video, giving it a thumbs up helps so much. But more than anything, leave me a comment. Let me know, what are your plans for the garden this year? What are you thinking about? What are you excited about? Are you scaling up? Are you scaling back? Like, what are you doing? What's informing your decisions for your gardening? Is it the years past? Is it a book? Is there any scarcity inside of it for you? What are you feeling when it comes to the garden this year? So my words are intuitive gardening. I will be intuitive gardening this year, intuitively preserving, intuitively cooking, and I'd love to invite you to join me. As always, thanks for being here. I appreciate you.